just wanted to get on here and talk about time lapses. Time lapses are pretty much a hobby for me. They're mostly just therapeutic. I live in the Midwest, and I'm originally from California, born in Colorado. So like I'm very much a beach, nature, mountain guy, snowboarding, hiking, all that stuff. That's what I gravitate towards. But in the Midwest, it's a lot of flat land. It's generally boring visually, comparatively at least. But the skies here are incredible, so you can't complain about that. And the weather's different. So for me, I have to get out and do something like that to see nature, whether it's here or even out there, preferably out there in the mountains, because I just come alive in the mountains. So as far as why, that's the why. But the how I do it is pretty basic. I just am rocking. I'd like to use better stuff. I would like to get a legit tripod and some different camera stuff solutions and some rails and maybe like a star tracker. I have some really complex ideas that I want to do that are like kind of expensive and time consuming. That maybe I'll go do that someday down the road. But right now, I mostly just rock this action tripod. I rock some of my DSLRs. So I got a 6D Mark II and a 5D Mark IV that I mainly use. I got a Nikon Z6 coming in that I surprisingly won a photo contest and with B&H Photo, and that's coming in soon. So I'm going to give that a whirl and see how that does on time lapses. But for now, I mainly have been using my 60 Mark II, which I don't use as much as I do my Mark IV because it has greater megapixels, a little bit better low light capabilities, and so I'm not going to get as much grain in that. I usually use these because they're screened like a mirrorless. At least my experience before with my Sony, and I've used the Fuji GFX. I rented that once, and those burn a lot of energy because EVF in the middle and the screen. Sometimes it leaves the viewfinder running, like so you'll see the shot and then you see it show the scene again. Like I'd rather have it turned off. Like the camera doesn't know you're doing a time lapse, so it's not thinking to preserve your power. While these just turn off by default. There's an intervalometer in the Canons, at least these DSLRs, that you just pick your shot. So it's like unlimited is what I usually go to. You can kind of pick a number of shots and create the interval every 1 second, 2, 3, 5, 10 hours. You could just kind of pick your intervals. So I grab my tripod, grab one of the DSLRs, I go to a location. And the other reason I like these DSLRs is the battery, like for a stripped down thing, is like those Canon LP batteries are pretty legit. They last quite a while on a full charge. With the two of them, I could get at least 8 hours of a non-stop shot where I'm just kind of firing either every second or every 3 seconds. I usually kind of keep it in that range, but I just get to a location, throw it on the tripod, lock in my composition, find a shot I really enjoy. Sometimes you just don't find one, you just move on. You know, you only have a window of time if you're going to do it like I do, where I kind of pick the last 3-4 hours of a sunset where I'm getting all of that quicker movement. Because when the sun's up high, it's burning a little slow. Sometimes you get something good in the daylight. If you're shooting a very specific scene where you're seeing shadows higher up or whatever your shot is, there's a lot of reasons that I avoid doing the middle of the day because light can change, clouds can jump in, and then if you have top clouds, the whole scene goes dark, and so many variables. But I usually aim for a shot that's kind of looking towards where the sun's setting, or at least pretty angled closer to it. Occasionally I shoot away from the sun, but for the most part I like to get all the light moving and everything. So I will lock in a shot that's kind of towards that direction. I will make sure that the first shot looks pretty good, but I'll overexpose it just a little bit, depending on how early I start, so that by the time the sun's setting, nothing's too hot. But then as the sun is setting, you're not getting anything getting too dark. And I'm shooting everything full raw. I'm not doing any compression. I'm not changing the size. I'm throwing a 128 gig SD card in there, so I'm getting a ton of images. I'm planning on getting anywhere between 400 and like 3,000 images in one time lapse. And for some people, that's like, oh, that's a lot of space. But if you make it to where you're doing, the whole process, you don't need to save all those RAWs. You just need to do the processing. So I just commit to 2,500-ish images. Make sure the first one's a little bit overexposed, and then I hope a little bit of guesswork and intuition based on what you're seeing. It'll take some experience, but let that shot run. I let it run with the interval running like typically like a 3 second. And when I do unlimited, let it run till it's dead. You can get power solutions to help go longer, but sometimes you don't really need to go that long. I might, on average, it's more like a 5-6 hour run. I've done longer where I let it go all night until the batteries are dead. I would have liked it a couple of times. I wish I had a power solution that lasted longer, but for the most part, it's enough to just rock fully charged batteries. And you can even do multiple. You know, I got several batteries, so it's like as soon as it dies, like I'll check on it. I'll see that's pretty close, so I'll wait for it. And I'll just remember the setting I had, make sure I remembered it was like 3 seconds or 2 seconds, and everything else should stay the same. All you gotta do is just turn it off real quick, pull it out, and try to make it real quick. And then you might see a little glitch in the jump if you took too long to make that switch, but it's usually fine. I never really have to do the battery thing. I feel like I got enough of a shot. So you get that exposure set up, you let it run. Usually just open it up in the Lightroom, create its own catalog, because you don't want to have a catalog filled with like 20 time lapses. And I mean, it's going to be a beast for your machine to deal with, and you're you're dealing with all those raws. I usually just fresh catalog. If I keep those photos because I actually loved it, and maybe there was a moment in that time lapse, I'm like, oh, that'd be a cool print, or that would be just cool to have or post online for social media or whatever. But I usually will hold on to the ones I like, but dump them all in there into Lightroom. I'll edit the first one to how it would look the best, and I know it's already overexposed. I'll try to make it look good. Then I sync that edit to the last photo, and the reason I do that is see how dark it gets. And if that ends up really black, which most of the time it does, I will bump that last image's exposure to what I think might be safe for the first one. And I just keep tweaking those two until I find a happy medium. And if it just stays too overexposed for that first one, I end up kind of finding the spot, maybe 100 images down, maybe 50 images down, where it starts to get usable. And it's retaining the last image in a way that's usable and visible and nice. Sometimes the sun's already set, but you might see a little cloud, or you might see something happening. So I try to save that last image as much as I can, but you kind of like will have to shift where the whole shot will be. So you might lose some in the front, might lose some in the back, or both. You have to find a little tight window. Maybe all you got that was usable was just the whole sunset section. So it's a little bit of guesswork. I know there's a lot of automated things that people do, or it automatically brackets, or it does things, but what you end up doing, you create an unnatural flow of time, where for me, I prefer it to be exactly how it felt. And after that, I then take it and I export it. And so I export the whole set. So I'll sync it, the first and the last, to all the other ones, and export that full res, no compression, JPEGs to its own folder. And the reason it's important for that is when you drop it into After Effects, it needs you to have it in a separate folder. Otherwise, it's going to pull in anything else you have in that folder. Not in the subfolders, you can get away with that, but it's best to do it in its own folder without any subfolders in that or any other files in that folder. And you drop it into After Effects, you'll see that it automatically kind of created its own little sequence looking thing. It'll show like the icon looks like it's got a sequence of images in it. You just start a new comp from that selection. It'll automatically create at the full res that the file's at a 30 frame second video, or at least sequence. At that point, you can kind of just set if your computer's not that great, you can set your resolution to playback at like 1/16 or 1/4 or whatever, and see how well it plays. You could do a quick scrub and see if you like the way it's looking. If it's off, sometimes I've had that happen. I had to go back in Lightroom, just do some quick adjustments on the overall feel, and it takes a second because all you got to do is find out you kind of saw what was wrong, and you go back and you just make that one tweak. And you export it. And there's a little bit more you can do in post in Premiere Pro and Lightroom. I mean, in Premiere Pro and After Effects. That if after your re-export, you could kind of tweak just that little bit of hair difference later. But trying to get the best out of the box as you can, like from that whole shoot. So After Effects is just creating your master file. And so when you export that, I usually do that in like a ProRes 444, 422, HQ, whatever's kind of you don't want to do fully uncompressed, can end up being way too big of a file, and there's no need for that. But I do try to keep it as high res as possible with the least amount of compression, so that you don't get a lot of banding. Like I've had, even when I've done that, some scenes ended up with them banding, because once you bounce out to H.264 or 5, or and you're putting it online, because then they have their own ways of compressing the video. So you want to like aim for that top quality that you can get if you're going to be sharing this online. But you can get away with keeping everything, ProRes, and however that can be delivered and converted if it's going to be displayed anywhere, and if you're doing it for a commercial gig. But I'm doing it for myself, so it doesn't matter so much, but I'm still aiming for, using ProRes. So I bounced that down to, whatever, HQ or 444. And then I will bring that into Premiere Pro at the full res too. I just create its own sequence from exactly how big it is, and then I watch it. And the reason I watch it there is to see if I can see any shake, because a lot of cameras have like image stabilizing, but image stabilizing can hurt it. Like the camera doesn't know you're doing a time lapse, so it might be seeing movement in the clouds or something, even though it's on a tripod, or it even might be noticing the shake of the shutter, even if it's subtle. Or if the wind is blowing, it's going to react to any movement. So if you don't have a solid tripod, like I don't have a good tripod, I just have this boring little action cam. So wind blows, this thing's going to feel it. So whether I have image stabilizing on or off, it's going to be shaking. So I kind of see how bad the shake is, and I apply the warp stabilizer in Premiere Pro over the whole file. And it might take a while sometime to go through, but it's worth it, because then once you play that back, you realize it's smooth, no shake. It detected good edges as long as your shot was good. Now you got a smooth shot with very little shake. And then I'll export that. Now that is my official like master file for the time lapse. And then I take that file, drop it back into Premiere, but I start a 4K ProRes time sequence and 24 frames. And so what you have going on here is you have a 30 frames file from After Effects that, and you kept it 30 frames for the render. And then when I drop in the master file, I'll just drop it into a 24 frames sequence, but then I go into the settings and I modify, interpret footage, and put it to the same frame rate as the sequence. So 24 frames for me. I prefer 24 frames for a lot of reasons. I can get into that later. But I do 24 frames for a reason. And it feels super cinematic and has more of a potential for like an emotional benefit for the video. If you're putting on good music, it's good. There's a lot of reason to go there. But I do 24 frames, and I'll stretch that timeline. After you do the interpret, you'll have a little bit more to stretch out. So now you have your full sequence in there on a 24 4K. You realize that it's kind of zoomed in. It'll be at you have to bring it down to like 72% or even 65%-ish. I forget what the actual number is. Sometimes it changes if I do a different camera, depending on the megapixels really and that ratio. And so sometimes I'll bring it all the way down to see how it looks, because it's nice to have it go from 6K into a 4K because it makes it even crisper. But at that point, you have a lot more to manipulate with. Your shot is now kind of like, say this is 16:9. The stars are going up here and the ground is going down about here, so you got a 2x3 crop. And what you're going to get from that is a lot of room to move around. So you don't have to have it static. You can kind of do some panning and zooming, kind of like a Ken Burns effect. And now you've got this kind of fluid thing. You can kind of look at the scene. If anything moves that's interesting, you create kind of a punch in, punch out kind of shot, or you can keep it still. It's just nature. You got the stars moving. Like in this one, you'll see that the moon kind of lights up the scene, so it goes dark. So all this light pollution, the sun had just set like an hour before this shot, maybe 2 hours max. And just that many stars were already out. Yosemite's amazing. But the moon comes out and you kind of see it light up these mountains here, and then it goes away because it goes behind that mountain. It's a very low moon rise for some reason. I think it's because of the time of year. But, for those reasons, you're kind of giving some room to move around, because like, I really liked what was going on down here, but I had to make sure my composition was at least getting what you see here. But I really hated that if I came down here, you were missing a lot of stars up here, and so picking your shot is pretty important. And then so now you've got your whole timeline up there. You're editing it, figuring out how you want your final to look. Then you could bounce that out, and now you've got your shot. But what I've also found is most social media is still stuck in 1080 land. Like, I think Instagram's still putting out a lot of 720 content. You can only do 1080 some ways. YouTube's compression is so intense. You got to be mindful of that. You could also put it on Vimeo, but Vimeo is definitely a different place to be putting something like this. It depends on what your plan is for the video. If you're doing it for a commercial gig, you know what you're gonna be doing. But for yourself, for like me, I like to keep it a high res. Like, I hope that by shooting this way, as technology progresses, like in 20 years, I want to be able to look at this time lapse in a pretty crystal way versus the compression and everything that you do with certain codecs right now can hurt it in 20 years. And like, that's why you see a lot of really blurry, bad videos on YouTube, is things get copied over the years. However, server technology is working. I don't know if we're going to have it to where like YouTube stuff over the years just gets more and more pixelated. Like, how are they retaining copies of a file over 30 years, 40 years? And we might be fine, but you never know. So for me, it's retaining the highest quality master file is really important. And then down the road, you have a reason to use it elsewhere. You could put it on, that's why you go to stores and you see TVs with all these really nice things. But that's pretty much it. That's kind of the broad stroke of everything. That's kind of why and how I do it. I will, in post, do a little bit more color. I'll throw maybe like a lumetri thing on there in Premiere Pro, and just subtle tweaks. Like if I needed it to feel a little warmer, or I saw a lot of magenta and I want to push some green in there. It's just little tweaks that kind of give it the final touch. Sometimes that little fade is good, but dangerous to go with fades because you get that really bad banding online. So you got to, it's going to take some trial and error figuring out what you want. But the other thing I was going to say is, what I said earlier about 24 frames, why it's important to me is you look at any of the good old films, like you think of like something like Braveheart or, Last Samurai or Interstellar or, films that have that really powerful cinematic touch. Obviously, there's music and there's motion and good writing and really good technical filming. But 24 frames, to me, like, it has such a rhythm to it that you can visibly see, while 60 frames, it's like this buttery, smooth thing, which is really helpful for certain applications. But I think for anything creative, you want to, like, even when Peter Jackson went 48 frames, I think that was a good decision in the sense that was the highest frame rate you should film at. Because then the cool thing is he could bounce down to 24 for anything. Like if he bounced it all out at 24, but he's shooting 48, his slow-mo was consistent with 24. And so shooting 24 is important for that. So why that matters in a time-lapse file is the same reason. Like if you throw some music up there with a time-lapse and you got that, you're seeing the little jitters of the light with the jitteriness of 24 frames, and you got the rhythm in the music. If it's all done right, it can feel like one solid piece. But you're rocking that at 60 frames, the music's gonna feel too slow. It's gonna feel out of place. It might feel like it's moving too fast, and so it depends on the application. If you're doing something that's like a really fast, like say you're going to say you did a gig officially for something like a Best Buy TV display setup, it's like having really smooth, clean stuff is nice. All these TVs have that really weird frame smoothing, blending thing tech that's going on, and it's not helping anyone who makes creative content, because creative is the dumb word, like emotionally driven content where you're trying to actually have a impact with the audience in a way that's emotional and affects them in a way where it's like it's art, while just a really smooth drone shot over a city doesn't have to have that feel, because it's just really showing clarity and smooth, and the clarity of the display, you're trying to sell something, that's a good application for not doing 24, because then it can kind of feel like, oh, this one's not as crystal clear as the other ones, or vibrant. It kind of tricks your mind into thinking that it matters, but it doesn't. It's best to turn that stuff off. So for me, I kind of aim for everything to have that 24 feel. A lot of, YouTube filmmakers and videographers will talk about the whole, like, see my hand, you get the motion blur when you're shooting 24 if you do everything right. That doesn't matter to me. That matters to a lot of people. Like, I like it. For me, it's more about this jitteriness having an application to movement. Like, if you watch Last Samurai, you see them riding the horses, and especially that end part, if you've seen it, like where Tom Cruise is, where the one dude gets shot up on the horses. Or even go back to like Platoon. I don't even remember if I ever saw the film, but there's that one, well-known shot of him falling on his knees and getting shot up. It's dramatic, obviously, but it's about that movement, that motion. It does something, and that's the motivation behind it. So you don't have to do the 24 angle. You could go 30, 60. If you're going for that really clean, like say you're doing a slow exposure, so you're doing like 1/10 of a second, and you're doing, or even slower, like a second or 2 seconds, water going by, and you're going for that cool, smooth, watery vibe, and you're doing this thing. Like at those points, you think you want to go smoother, because then it can feel weird. Like like you've probably seen films where suddenly they did a slow motion scene and it was like 12 frames a second, but they didn't feel intentional. It felt like they needed it to be slow motion, but they weren't filming at the double frame rate to make it work. So they're just slowing it down to make it fit the speed and the emotion that they were going for, and they couldn't reshoot. That can happen when you're going for those kind of very cool, like I'll show one of that I did of a tent. And in this one, you kind of see my buddy Jordan kind of moving around the tent, setting up a tent. And it's one we did on a whim, and I hadn't tried it yet, so I just thought I'd film that and we shoot that. And you could kind of see him blurring through it, and there's an application for that. But I still did that at 24 because the video we were doing was going to feel right with 24. If that ended up being this randomly buttery smooth scene, it would break the consistency of the whole video. And so that's it.